All right, this video is dedicated to the two mottos of embrace uncertainty and question everything, which if you'd like to write these at the top of your document that you submit, that you're welcome to do so. They're not officially the secret phrases. There are no official secret phrases, but there is a beagle right here who might want to say hello. Let's see if I can get her on camera. There's a nose. All right. And then you saw some of the messy office that you're not allowed to see, but just a little different. For this, which in the future will be a standalone video on persuasive writing, particularly the chain of reasoning concept, and some more information about working with counter arguments. I've been slowly accumulating more parts of that as classes. So rather than putting them in a really huge assignment dedicated to the persuasive writing process, but that's my goal with this. So I'm making this in the summer of 2021 and plan to use it for quite a while to talk about the persuasive writing process, particularly chain of reasoning. My classes will always feature a persuasive essay, so that's not really going to change. The number of it might, however. So I'm going to refer to what for the summer is essay 2 as the persuasive essay, because up until this summer, it's been essay 3. So let's just essay 2, essay 3, let's just call it the persuasive essay or a persuasive essay or an argument, a persuasive argument. Where'd Satchel go? All right, she's gonna leave. Enough of that. She can't be the star of the video. She's gonna take off. So my goal in this is to talk about various concepts around persuasive writing and particularly the chain of reasoning. For my students in the current quarter, this is part of a class assignment, and so there are specific things to do. There's questions to answer and an activity. This is all written on the page in the assignment where this video exists, so you should just refer to that. I don't want to go through that because I want to make this a standalone, and there might be times when I don't use the exact same questions or the activity, or I do something different with this video, or I just have students watch it to absorb the content and the lessons about persuasive writing and the chain of reasoning. So let's get going. Although I want to say I really feel sort of naked without rock music that I would have in the live classroom on campus. I actually looked right before I started this for public domain music, and there's actually quite a bit of music that's not bound by copyright that I'm even modern music that I might be able to use in these videos, and you know, that would change things. I would really like to have some music to start the video, and that might even play throughout the video. I just saw a video by one of my colleagues made with Screencast-O-Matic that has music throughout it that kind of provides these transitions, and I never have that. So but that said, let me go in here, and I got some stuff on the screen that was part of the previous, and I'm just going to get rid of that. Now I will direct students to some of the content for the different questions. You know, so as I said, this is part of chain of reasoning instruction and a future part of the persuasive writing series, as you can see there. And so the first question that students answer, I'm about to go through, which is, I can even show you the question because it's always going to be something I'm going to do, which is recap the lessons so far in the course on persuasive writing. So what have we learned about so far? So we've already learned a variety of concepts, which will always be true because I'll never start a quarter with the persuasive essay. And if I do, I will figure out a way to introduce all these concepts. So I'm not going to do these one at a time. So maybe we'll do it 3 at a time. How about that? And then I'll fly them over here and paste them in. So What to put in an introduction. Start with a hook, provide context, things the reader needs to know, and then end with a thesis. So we spend a lot of time with thesis statements. That's already in the Persuasive Writing series. There's a whole thesis video that talks about writing a thesis in a problem solution format. That sort of, and I teach my because should method here. Because of these reasons, the audience should do what? And so that's still always going to be true. These are things that we've already started to focus on. And we did some summary writing because we included a summary in the previous essay, which is true this quarter. It might not be true every quarter, but for the near future, it certainly will. And even if I am not having students include a summary in their essay, we will practice summary writing. It's something I've done for a really long time. And I always do at the beginning of the quarter because it's good to get you to read things and think about what they say and then sort of see if you can compress that. So that's a thought process that I always think is very valuable. And I have students go through it. So the importance of context, what do readers need to know to understand your thesis, to understand your subject matter, to understand, all of the things surrounding the argument that you're going to make. Often this is driven by the 6 W's, what, where, when, why, how. How is a W, ends in a W. We have those. The content is always aimed at the audience. This is true of everything we write. We identify our purpose, we identify our audience. We identify how to achieve our purpose for our audience. What are we trying to do? And mostly in academic classes, you're trying to persuade. Even if we're having you do an analysis assignment, which will be one of my assignments I'll be going back to in courses when we're back on campus. And it's been part of stuff I've taught previously. That's still persuasive. You're persuading, you still have a thesis, you still do all the same things. You're kind of persuading people to believe your analysis. But you write a little, there's some things you do and some things you don't do. But you're always trying to achieve a purpose for an audience. I have done assignments before that are strictly informative. I've done a process writing assignment before in which I have students write instructions. That could come back in the course. And then the content for the audience is just, getting them to follow step-by-step instructions to achieve a finished product of some kind. All right, so we've already focused on the basics of counter arguments, which is going to be true pretty much in any class I teach once we get to persuasive writing. And we focused on paragraph structure using the PI formula, which I probably would teach from now on because I really like it. So point, information, explanation, and that is a driving force through the rest of the comments that I make here, and we're going to use it as a basis to make additional points about persuasive writing. Writing strong claims and what makes a claim strong. So you'll notice that my font changed, which is really annoying, so we'll just do that. Writing strong claims and what makes a claim strong is something that we focused on. And then the last things here are unearthing buried topic sentences and claims. So presumably that will always be a lesson that precedes this one, in which you work on paragraphs by identifying topic sentences that make claims that are buried at the bottom of a paragraph and moving them up so that they are leading the paragraph. We focused on SIP, signal phrases, and the concept of setting up and following up source use, which is something I expand on in this video. And then various other good ideas for inclusion in the writing learning companion, which is sort of your study buddy for all the things that you should be remembering as you're drafting and as you're revising, as you're planning to draft, as you're editing and revising, as you're getting things ready for your portfolio. They are part, there is a sort of a guide for writing And it's something I'll probably use from now on in my courses now that I have conceived it. It's a reasonably new concept. But we study writing. That's part of the process. So let's do some new stuff. And this leads us to our second question. And I might as well just reveal these to the audience because they introduce the content. They're also the questions to do for this class assignment. And they may not always be, but they always will introduce the content because it's the content that's next. So second question, based on my explanations in this video, what is the chain of reasoning in a persuasive essay and why is it important? All right, so let's get into that. Don't bother. Watch Chris play with Microsoft Word. There we go. Chain of reasoning is your best arguments in the best order with counter arguments. Think of the chain of reasoning much as it sounds like it is. Visualize a chain. Each link of the chain is connected to the previous link and to the following link. All the links add up together to form the chain. Each chain link is a unit of your argument. This unit can be a paragraph or a set of paragraphs, as I'll explain later in the video. The entire chain can be summarized by your thesis. Chain starts at a point A, your introduction, ends at a point B, your conclusion. Though unlike an actual chain, these beginnings and endings have functions that serve the whole, as we know about introductions and conclusions in writing. In other words, just because it starts at a place, we have to do certain things when we start an essay, rather than just connecting a chain to a wall. It's a little different. The metaphor isn't perfect here, but you get the idea. It's a good metaphor, though, a chain of reasoning for visualizing, but not only should the entire essay form on a macrocosmic level, a chain, the whole essay is a chain, that's the macrocosm. But this chain of reasoning made through arguments to convince the reader of your thesis is the macrocosmic global chain of the entire essay. But each part, each paragraph or set of paragraphs is a microcosm that follows the same chain of reasoning pattern. So just like you link up paragraphs or sets of paragraphs that form units of reasoning, arguments, in a chain of reasoning, a chain of arguments in your essay, each argument itself, whether it's a single paragraph or a set of paragraphs, is itself a chain of reasoning to introduce a claim, to introduce evidence, to introduce explanation analysis, to move on to other claims or other evidence and so on, to logically flow to prove your points. And ultimately, to add up to proving your thesis, to persuading the reader of your thesis. So why is a chain of reasoning so important? Well, reasons or reasoning is one of the three key elements of persuasion that will persuade your audience. And I want to put these on the screen, but I'm having issues here. And of course, I'm not getting what I want. One of the three key elements that will persuade your audience, which are good reasons, because good reasons persuade, establishing and leveraging common ground, and appealing to emotions. These are really the three big persuasive tools for persuading our audience. Good reasons persuade. If you have good reasons, people can acknowledge that they're good reasons, they internalize them, they're persuaded. You establish and leverage common ground. If you can establish something that you and your audience agree upon, common ground, then you can leverage that as part of your persuasive appeal. And lastly, appealing to emotions is probably the most powerful persuasive tool of all, probably more powerful than logic and good reasoning, because emotional appeals are incredibly powerful. Because a lot of people are unable to separate their emotions from their intellect. Lots of people operate solely on an emotional level. And they form opinions and they react to situations solely based on emotions. And I don't say that because I think that's necessarily bad. I think emotions are powerful and a good thing. They're part of who we are. We can't deny them. The people that try to be solely logical and intellectual, like Mr. Spock in Star Trek, and that's unrealistic. In fact, if you know Star Trek, you know that the Vulcans themselves just repressed their emotions. They weren't really without emotion. They're sort of pretending to be without emotion. And they created a whole society to manage emotions. So it's important to have a chain of reasoning, because the links of the chain of the reasoning will become the main ways that you persuade your audiences. Good reasons persuade. You have a series of good reasons and reasoning, good arguments. Those you're gonna have a better chance of persuading in those situations. Now, often, we just think about our own arguments first, and the arguments of the opposition we think about maybe second, but maybe third. But what if, instead of thinking about leading the whole essay with our arguments, what if we think about putting our opponent's arguments first? What if we structure our essay by arguing against counter arguments which are put in the claim position and then refuted in our paragraphs? What if we did that? Well, it's a good idea. It's a good idea. Now, granted, usually, and here I'm going to manipulate things a little bit that you can't necessarily see what I'm doing. Usually, persuasive essays introduce a series of claims that develop and expand upon the thesis. The basic structure of laying forth a complex thesis with keywords and concepts that are then clearly linked by name in the topic sentences for all the paragraphs, topic sentences that start out those paragraphs, follow the forms of this traditional approach. You have a thesis, you have a bunch of keywords in it that apply to your topics. When you write the topic sentences for those topics, you use some of those keywords or descriptions of those concepts so that the reader can follow what you're doing, and it makes sense. We can see how all the arguments are developing the thesis because they share some of the same language, some of the same concepts. The thesis shows off the entire argument of your essay, and then you develop that argument one topic at a time. Let me say that again so that it really sinks in, because you'd be amazed how this does not necessarily sink in with people. The thesis shows off your entire argument, and then you develop the argument one topic at a time. However, opponents of your thesis, typically your audience in a persuasive situation, are going to be resistant to your arguments. They're going to resist. Jamming these down their throats might not be very persuasive, and the resisting reader may just stop reading. Like, I don't need to listen to this crap. Why am I listening to this crap? So if you're leading with your arguments, you may be handicapping yourself from the start. But what if you fed the reader their own arguments first and foremost to lure them in, and then reasonably and ethically, proving yourself to be trustworthy, refuted these arguments using logic, credible evidence, and even emotional appeals? Because your audience is always the people that disagree with your thesis. You don't need to convince the people that agree with your thesis, though those are the people that might be more likely to read your essay because they agree with it. But since they already agree, they don't need persuading. They don't need convincing. You're writing to the people that disagree. You're writing to the people that need convincing. You're writing to the people that need persuading. And you're going to provide them with some sort of call to action for what they should do. There's a problem. These are problems. Because of these problems, you audience, you who disagree with me should do this thing that I'm going to argue that you should do. The argument is really in the call to action, the thing to change about the world, or the thing that the audience needs to change about themselves, perhaps. And of course, you're writing in the third person, so you don't say you. All right. So, as I was saying, what if you fed the reader their own arguments first and foremost to lure them in, and then reasonably and ethically, because you're now trustworthy, you avoid hostile language, you avoid really outrageous bias, though obviously you're biased, because if you have an opinion, you're biased, but you reasonably and ethically refute, which is argue against, to dismiss their arguments using logic, credible evidence, and even emotional appeal. So let's try it. All right, so now we come to the third question of the assignment, but also to introduce the next content, which is here. All right, so why might it be a better structure for a persuasive essay to lead with counterclaims and refute them rather than leading with your own claims and introducing counterclaims later? So this is the chain of reasoning by leading with counter arguments. So how does that roll? Let's get into that a little bit, and let me introduce a subject for you, because this is really where the current version of the persuasive assignment all started, was with Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. And even if I shift to a different kind of a thing, this example will still be a good example, because it's a good example. So let's brainstorm and analyze content for a paper on Black Lives Matter using some actual student work. I'm going to start with a claim by a student and some of the ideas that the student had in we'll say his paper. I can't remember if it was a he or a she. We'll just say his, because I could say her, sometimes I do, let's say her. Let's make it her instead of him, just so that it shows that I'm not being a sexist pig, who always thinks of men as my examples, because I don't. I try to use the accurate pronouns if I have and mostly my examples are women students, mostly. There's, if I informally in my mind, just thinking about my samples, I know that the majority of them were written by women. Not that they were all written by women. So the student writer has chosen to argue for the Black Lives Matter cause and wants to dispel misunderstandings and misinformation used to criticize and vilify the organizations and the 2020 protests staged in its name. So let's look at a claim to start, and start with a student claim. And I'll show you how to evolve this claim by analyzing it, evolving it some more to demonstrate the writing process. Please remember that we're starting with a counterclaim and arguing against it. So we're not starting with the point of view that the student had. So this is a kind of a counterpoint point structure. And it has to be clear to the audience that that's what we're doing, because otherwise they'll get really confused if our thesis is pro Black Lives Matter, but then all of our topic sentences are kind of anti Black Lives Matter. That's not going to make sense. So we're going to, have a pro Black Lives Matter thesis, but then make clear that some people argue this thing. We're going to make clear that it's not necessarily the writer's position, and we're doing this counterclaim structure. So we got to remember that, right? So we'll start with the first version and we'll analyze and develop. Okay, so here's the first version, and of course, it's doing it again. There we go. All right. So first version directly from the student essay. Republicans are wrong about George Floyd sparked Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. Of course, now that I'm reading that, that reads really weird too. What the student means is the Black Lives Matter protests that were sparked by the George Floyd murder in the summer of 2020. But the way it reads is that George Floyd sparked the Black Lives Matter protests himself, but he was dead. So, you know, little weird in the phrasing. But, you know, there's other problems of the phrasing with this particular claim. It's too direct. It's too off-putting. If you consider yourself a Republican, you're going to be immediately turned off by being told Republicans are wrong. That's not a very good way to tackle counter argument. You know, it doesn't make you trustworthy. It makes you kind of hostile. You got to be reasonable. You got to be trustworthy. You got to be ethical. That's part of the ethos, part of the rhetorical triangle. It's also lacking in reasoning. And of course, you're going to have lots of reasoning that will follow the claim, but you got to have some reasoning baked into the claim itself. It's a claim. It's definitely an argument. Republicans are wrong. But what are they wrong about? We don't know. And so it's vague. It's a little hostile. And those are just some of the problems with it. So let's evolve it. Here's a second version, which again is not coming out the way I want it to. So I got to do that. So some opponents of Black Lives Matter have argued that protests in the summer of 2020 were mostly violent and outlets for criminals, anarchists, and outside agitators. Okay, this is better, right? We dropped. Now here I'm rewriting, okay? We just started with what the student did. And now I've abandoned, I'm not even showing you the whole essay. I'm just showing you a claim that led a paragraph. And now we're rewriting, we're revising, which, you know, in a way we're doing before we even, like, this is in the pre-drafting process, right? Yeah, you know, like write a working version of the claim and then look at what's wrong with it and try to improve it. You can get help with that. You can get tutoring with that. Or you can just absorb this lesson and do it yourself, you know, or all of it, right? So we've lost Republicans, and we lost Republicans are wrong. So that's good. That makes it more reasonable. We've also made it clear that it's some opponents, because Republicans is too sweeping. Not all Republicans are wrong. Not all Republicans share the exact same point of view. Despite the fact that some of the TV media try to convince, and Twitter and Facebook and stuff tries to convince us otherwise. So some opponents of Black Lives Matter have argued that the protests were mostly violent outlets for criminals, anarchists, and outside agitators. All right, so we have changed it so that the audience isn't immediately on the defensive, so that they dig in and we can't persuade them. But the reasons for the protests has been lost in this version. The previous version mentioned George Floyd. It didn't mention it in a very good way. It was confusing, but it at least mentioned him. So we've lost the reason for the protests. But that might be okay, because, you know, we're going to continue to evolve it. At least we're on the right track, right? But we identify we have to put something in about, you know, about why these protests occurred. Can we make it even better and try to include the elements of a good claim, which I'll explain in the analysis following up the next version? So how about a new version? Okay, get ready for this. It's a big one. Oh, it's a big one. No, it doesn't have to be in bold. All right, and it came out in Courier, so yay. All right, third version. Some people have argued that, huge parenthetical, a positive, whoa, okay, but follow me here, because I could read, notice, some people have argued that, follow to the end of the M dash, the people joining the resulting Black Lives Matter. So that reads, You got people, the people, it's a little awkward, but it reads. Some people have argued that, angered by the perceived injustice of the deaths of African Americans at the hands of police or public safety-minded civilians, most notably George Floyd's murder, the people joining resulting Black Lives Matter protests throughout the world, especially in America, were by and large violent, as Antifa and other violent insurgents turned American streets into war zones on a near nightly basis for months. All right. I played around with the language on this for quite a while. It's still obviously kind of awkward. You know, originally I had this whole bit here subordinated at the beginning of the sentence, and then some people have argued that the people joining the protests were by and large violent. You know, we can break down the sentence into the simpler forms. Some people have argued the people in the protests were violent, they were Antifa, they created war zones nightly, it was terrible, right? And then this is just a big chunk on why, and kind of stuck in the best place I could figure out to stick it if it's not going to be at the beginning, which it really should be, but I couldn't figure out how to do that because this whole part applies to these people. This part applies to people arguing that these people are violent. So it's got two different people in the sentence. So that's tricky, right? So, but you know, it's somewhat better. It's better in a lot of ways as a claim. So let's break it down. This is a counterclaim to the thesis that is brewing in my mind as a writer. Let's assume that I'm the writer now of this particular essay rather than some unnamed student. And I can't remember if the student is male or female. So like, what am I going to do with that? So I made up this claim based on the original student claim and evolved it. Now I could have found it in a source because I've made it up based on things I've heard people say, kind of taking off from where the student started. And you can do the same, you know, so you don't have to source your counterclaims necessarily. You can write them based on your knowledge without citing them, because this is sort of a broad, some people say this stuff, and then you're definitely probably going to show me some of that, you know, at least a little bit of what some of these people actually say. But you don't lead paragraphs with source use. So you're not going to lead with a quote or lead with a paraphrase. But this isn't technically a paraphrase. It's too big and sweeping, so it's okay. A counterclaim does carry more weight if it comes directly from a person. But as I said, you can't lead a paragraph with a quote. So you still introduce the claim, and then one or more people who say it, say some or all of it, would follow in the paragraph, right? So you introduce the basic ideas in the claim, and then later have some source material. But what if I haven't written my thesis yet? What if I am starting in the middle with these different claims? It's actually a good idea to start by thinking about the counterclaims that the audience has and figuring out how to refute those, and just start writing those sections. I think I've said it before, I'll say it again, I say it in a lot of videos, you don't have to write your essay in order. You have a computer. You can insert at will. You can move things around. You could do all sorts of magical tricks that we couldn't do long ago when we were carving our essays into stone tablets with chisels. I'm not making that up. So I'm sorry, Dan. But anyway, you don't have to write it in order, you know, and this is where a lot of students, you know, I tell them to get over the writer's block thing, you know, like just focus on this part, start working on this part, you know. In fact, it's often a good idea to delay writing the thesis. Now, some students can't work that way. They got to write the thesis. I mean, figure out how you work, right? If you are stuck getting started and the thesis might be part of what is holding you back, don't worry about the thesis to start. Just identify parts you know you need to write about and start writing those parts. And after you've accumulated a certain number of parts, you can start to get an idea of what the thesis might be. And even if you don't nail something beautiful and perfect, you're probably not going to in a first draft anyway. It's why we do multiple drafts in the classes on composition. It's just how we do it. All right. So I have not actually written a thesis, and I'm not actually going to share a thesis with you about these claims that I'm showing you. But later I can assemble the claims and see how they add up and construct a thesis from those. And after I assemble a bunch of claims or a bunch of content, a variety of paragraphs, I can figure out, can I use all of what I have? Do I need to discard some of what I have? Do I need to add some stuff I don't have? Once I start to have a bunch of parts, I can look at what I have and decide what I need and what I don't need. I decided to lead with counter-argument claims and then refute them with my counterclaims and evidence rather than lead with my own claims, because it's better for the audience. As I've said before, the audience shares these claims. These claims come from the audience. If I lead with my claims, they will just tune me out. If I lead with their claims, I can maybe convince them that their claims are flawed or completely off base, unprovable, and false. Okay, so let's test this claim for its parts and how they function. Not all claims need all these parts, but many will. So let's kind of break down what we have. So first we have, some people have argued. All right. This is the signal that introduces the idea that I am sharing an argument that's not my argument. I am sharing an argument that is not my own. It's counter argument. Okay. Is this a claim? All right. So the first test of any claim is that it's debatable. Is what you are presenting arguable? You know, are there different sides? Are there different positions? Is it something that makes people go, wait a minute, I have things to say about that? You know, so is it debatable? Yes, indeed. This is a debatable argument. It's an opinion. It's not shared by everyone. The claim argues that protesters turn the streets into a war zone. That's not an opinion shared by everyone. And so it's clearly a debatable claim. Now, all right, so what do we have so far? We have signal that it is a counterclaim with language like some people have argued, right? We have, is it debatable? Yes, it is. So the next thing we want is the why. There's got to be reasons. There's got to be reasons. Claims must be based on reasons. So why is the claim being made? Do we have reasons here? Yes, we do. We have context about what events sparked the Black Lives Matter protests last summer, the reasons why those protests occurred. We have the reasons for protest, anger that those individuals had. We also have individuals to blame in the message, which is in clear condemnation in the claim. Antifa and insurgents are to blame for turning cities into war zones. So yes, we have lots of reasons for what's being debated, the argument. I mean, maybe it could be clearer, but it's in there. These are really the main things about claims. You don't always signal that what you're doing is a counterclaim if you're not structuring this way where you lead with counterclaims, you know. So if you're not signaling that it's a counterclaim because it isn't a counterclaim, then you just start with testing whether it's debatable, testing whether you have reasons and answers the question of why. If we were asked why of the claim, then you have answers for that in there. And these are questions to ask. Is it debatable? Why? You know, in response to what it's arguing. And then so what, which is so what should be done, you know, because our whole essay is these are problems. This is what should be done all through the essay. That's what a problem solution structure is. And often I have taught students to just like write about the problems and then write about the solution, and then argue for the solution. But actually it's better to go through problems and argue for the solutions all the way through, because you know, you're you know, focused on the argument for what should change all along. Okay, so hang on a sec. What you couldn't see is that I had actually 2 different baseball games going while I'm doing this, which I'm not ashamed to tell you, but they both ended and it was distracting me, so I thought I would shut them off. And both teams lost, so I'm disappointed. I should just quit. I should just quit what I'm doing. Okay, so what? So does the claim have a so what? Is it arguing for what should change, and what should be done about this? No, it's actually not. Let's fix that. Okay, I move things around a little bit, but it works. So signal it's a counterclaim if you're leading with counterclaims. Is it debatable? Why? And so what? So we rewrite this. It's pretty much the exact same thing all the way through. This is the last one we did. I'm not going to read it over again for like the 4th time, you know, but I just added this. And now in hindsight, Black Lives Matter opponents want to make the truth as they see it known now that tempers have calmed and the evidence is clear to see. Okay, there's some writing problems there. I got a couple of uses of the word now, but I leave it rough like this on purpose, because I want you to see what writing looks like in process. I mean, I could keep working on this and iron out more of these problems that I'm mentioning, but I'd rather leave it rough so that you could, you know, see that in process, and so that I can mention what some of these problems are that crop up in writing, that I immediately see need some attention, right? But the important thing here is that now we have a so what. So, you know, people are arguing that people like Antifa and others have turned the cities into war zones, in the name of Black Lives Matter, and that now that we have some hindsight, it's been a year, and we can look back and the truth should come out about what was really going on in those protests, that were really not Black Lives Matter, but they were Antifa, and that's the argument that's frequently being made. Okay, so, and it's a huge, big sentence. Whoever said that this work would be simple and brief? Nobody ever said that. No, academic writing is naturally complex. This is not a run-on, however. I did spend enough time to work on this and make it a complete sentence, a big complete sentence, but a complete grammatically correct sentence. I will double check this before I put it on the page with this video, but I'm pretty positive that I did that. Also notice the so what is clearly attributed to the audience. So we bring back the audience. Some people argue this. Black Lives Matter opponents want this change, the real truth to come out. So the Black Lives Matter protests are the some people. So I could have started with Black Lives Matter opponents, but I didn't. I thought it worked this way too. But we always see these things, you know, like, would it be better this other way? I mean, that's part of the rewriting process. That's why when students say, well, I didn't know, I couldn't, you know, I'm waiting for your feedback, I couldn't see anything to revise on my own. I'm like, how can you not? Can't you just question what you're doing? Can't you just look at your language and think about what you're doing and how it reads and how it comes off and what it communicates, and is it communicating effectively, and could you make it better? And like, just start thinking like that. You know, the more you start thinking like that and you practice that thought process, the better you'll get at it. You know, how do you think I got to this point? You know, like, and it wasn't like I was really taught that. You know, I was just encouraged to look at the language. Occasionally I had it pointed out to me, like I just pointed it out to you. So, okay. In my original version, so I actually skipped the version that I didn't show you, but in my original version, when I added this answer, the so what, I didn't clearly attribute it to the audience. So it made it sound like almost the writer of the essay might want the truth to come out. And it was obfuscated. It wasn't clear that I'm still in the counterclaim. I'm still in the, some people argue this, some people want this truth to come out. That's what the counterclaims are about, not necessarily what the regs. So I'm going to refute that. So I didn't want the truth sought to be confused as what the writer of the essay wants, as opposed to the other, you know, what the opponents want. Okay. So let's consider some other things here. Okay, so we got a pretty robust claim. Okay, got a pretty robust claim, but our work is not done. Now we have to develop the paragraph or a set of paragraphs to support that claim, right? So we start with a claim. Paragraphs start with claims. All paragraphs in an argumentative essay, other than the introduction and the conclusion, start with a claim. All paragraphs. Then we don't immediately want to jump into evidence. This is a mistake students often make. They have a claim, they immediately jump into evidence with no context whatsoever. Like, why all of a sudden introducing evidence? What is this about? I don't understand. I don't even fully understand your claim. Tell me more about it. So usually there should be some sentences. Sometimes you can do it in a single sentence. Sometimes you need a few sentences. It depends on your claim. With the claim that we were just working with, there's a lot of stuff in there. So I would have to do more explanation, context for the claim. Then I can start to get into refutation, because this is leading with the counterclaims. Okay, so I've led with the counterclaims. So I'm going to refute, which is a word for to disagree and to dismiss. I'm going to have evidence for my refutation. I'm going to explain and analyze the evidence. I'm going to do some more refuting. I'm going to have more evidence. I'm going to explain and analyze, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What is context for the claim? So that might be the part that is the most confusing in this list of my structure and my chain. This is the microcosm chain. That's part of the macrocosm of chain links for the whole essay, right? So information. Readers may need if the information is not elsewhere in the essay. You know, you might not have delivered all of the context. In fact, it's often a good idea to spread out your context. Otherwise, your introduction is huge, right? Especially if you're writing about relatively complex things. So give general context at the beginning of an essay, and then figure out, okay, I need context for this claim that is about who are the protesters? Was it a war zone? You know, there's different things that are in that claim. Is there a truth that's not coming out? Okay, so there's like the three big things, right? So jumping right from the claim, as I said, into sharing evidence may be too abrupt. Readers might not be ready for the evidence until they better understand the situation to which the evidence is applied. So you might want information. As such, this essay writer should unpack the vital elements of this claim and use reasoning to begin to crush these untrue assertions and beliefs of the audience and set up evidence that will soon be introduced to refute them. You know, so you start to introduce information, some of which might start to, you know, refute the claim, some of which may come from sources. So you may start having some cites in there amongst your own writing, but you're using reasoning. You know, maybe you start by identifying the things in the claim that just don't make sense. In this case, because it's a counterclaim, because we're refuting, you know, in a different kind of structure where you're presenting your own arguments, your goals, the things you're doing would be different. But I'm trying to promote this way of doing it because of all the reasons I've already told you. So, you know, to figure out what some of that would be for this particular claim that we've been working on, which I've taken off the page, but I think you may remember it, or it's still near the video outside of the video world here. So to think about this context, let's look at some of the ways that we could refute the claim. And please remember, we might not be able to refute this claim completely in a single paragraph. We may need to spread out our refutation over at least 2 or more paragraphs. That's why I keep coming back to this idea that that the single paragraph per topic, next topic, 1 paragraph structure is probably not a structure that's sustainable for persuasive essays. That we want, you know, so we learned on another essay prior to this one, which may change in various quarters, but we learned basic rules. We focused more on single source use per paragraph to deal with a point. We led with our own arguments and not counterclaims. We put counterclaims all together in a paragraph. That's generally what I always do in a first essay prior to this one, or a couple essays, or the essay directly preceding this one, or whatever. Now we want more complex structures. We might want a 2-paragraph introduction because we have a lot of context, or we want to do a very sophisticated hook. And we might use paragraphs in sets, you know, and I'll have more to say about that in a few minutes. So let me get into some of the easy ways to refute this claim. Some of the easiest things. And here, let me work it through so it's a little easier to see. Most of the protests and protesters were nonviolent. So I can get evidence for that. There's lots of evidence for that. That show, you know, I can identify where the violence took place, and you know, we can even have data, you know, out of this many protests worldwide, because there were protests in other countries. You know, this is how much violence there was versus protesters that were nonviolent until provoked, and some remain nonviolent even when provoked, like the wall of mobs in Portland. The majority of the destruction centered around Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, which I think is true. That's at least my impression, but that's something that I would have to check again with evidence to see what's out there. The protests that did turn violent may not have done so at all, or been as bad without the police responding with inappropriate force. So often the protests turned violent because the protesters were provoked. That the violence was not unprovoked against police officers. Now, that's not true 100% of the time. And again, I would have to have evidence to support that, but that's my impression. The smart police move in Minneapolis was abandoning a police station, allowing angry protesters to destroy it as a kind of therapeutic, cathartic, and necessary action. So early in the protests, one of the worst examples of destruction of property and violence was an angry mob that completely destroyed a police station. The police abandoned it and left it to the mob to destroy. And perhaps, and some people have argued this was a necessary therapeutic, cathartic. If you don't know what cathartic means, you can look it up. Important thing for them for healing. Protests were also fueled by federal forces without identification that apprehended people without cause or due process. That's been confirmed by multiple sources. We had video of it. It's a pretty well-established fact that happened. And now we know that those federal forces were from the Department of Justice. The lack of empathy and understanding from the federal government, especially the president, antagonized people and fueled anger and continued protests. I think that's relatively well established. You might not agree if you are a fan of the president or of the federal government last year, or what might now be more years in the past, after, depending how many years I reuse this video. There is no evidence that Antifa played much or any role. This is my belief. I do not have evidence for that. I would go hunting for that because it's my belief. And if I could find a way to corroborate that statement and prove it, I would do that. But just people saying it was Antifa doesn't make it Antifa. I'll say that much. There were outside agitators who are unknown, and it may be as likely that these are those wanting to make the protests worse and to ruin the reputation of the Black Lives Matter organization, and not Antifa, who would not necessarily want that, but I don't know. I had a video on my blog while this was going on, but the video has been taken off YouTube, so I no longer have access to it. But early in the most violent times of the protests, shortly after the murder of George Floyd, there was this person dressed all in black. They got out of this car, started going down this block with these batons, smashing windows, just smashing, walking as fast as he could, getting back in a car and driving away. Don't know who that was, but it wasn't one of the Black Lives Matter protesters that were out in the street saying, hey, this murder of George Floyd sucked. This is terrible. This should change. This is not the way things should be. It was someone, that just came in, smashed up a bunch of windows, and then got back in a car and drove away. I saw the video. I don't have it anymore. You could argue it was staged. That person could have been Antifa. I have no way to prove one way or the other. But there was plenty of evidence like that was coming out around that time. All right, so I have a bunch of plans here for refuting the claim, right? Now, how much text space I give all of these different refutations may vary. As I said, I have to investigate. I have to look for evidence. I have to build my refutation of the counter argument, right? For some ideas, I may be able to use just common sense and reasoning, or just some sweeping source use, some basic examination of the majority of the news footage and various news stories from credible sources will reveal that the protests were by and large peaceful and violence was isolated and short-lived, or simple vandalism or opposition to the police. Now, in any kind of a situation like this, looting is going to happen. There are people out there that see it as an opportunity to just go crazy because they're probably not going to get arrested, and it's pandemonium and chaos. This is not new to this situation. This always happens in these types of situations. So that's not that unusual or shocking. And the people that are there for the cause are maybe not those looters. A lot of the protesters have talked about that, have gone on record to say that the looters are just opportunistic people. They weren't really around in the protests for the cause. They just come down. So lots of people are drawn to a riot or a mob event that take advantage of it. Proving that Antifa, this organization that is not really an organization, it's a a loose affiliation of individuals that are opposed to fascism, which I got to say isn't, well, from what I can tell, a bad thing to be opposed to. You know, Hitler was a fascist, Mussolini was a fascist, the Japanese government in World War II was fascist. Those are some famous fascists. Stalin, though leading a communist government, a different kind of communism than socialism, was fascist after World War II, slaughtered a lot of his people. So this whole idea that Antifa can be blamed when people can't really define what Antifa is, or even, you know, talk to an Antifa organization because the organization doesn't exist quite in the way the Black Lives Matter. I don't believe there's an Antifa website. Don't quote me on this because I haven't checked. I'm in the process of writing about Antifa on my blog, which if I reuse this for multiple years, I might have this all documented now because I'm curious to investigate myself. But certainly, you know, that would be something I would investigate, try to get evidence for, to try to refute that claim that it was, you know, Antifa's to blame for the violence and the riots and all these different things. Also, the antagonistic federal response. I want more evidence about that. Once I understand my subject, my arguments, and my evidence, I can explain and analyze my sources and continue to develop these arguments. You know, because if I'm using this structure with the counterclaim, I'm leading with counterclaims, and then I'm refuting them to promote my own arguments. So what I really want to do is avoid the straw man, which is when you set up a really weak argument that you can easily knock down, you know. So I want a reasonable counter argument that I can reasonably refute and prove to be false. Though often with counter arguments, you might accept some elements of the argument. Like I wouldn't argue that there was no violence at all. There was. I wouldn't argue that it's wrong to trash and totally gut a police station. That's wrong. The destruction of private property was a crime. That's wrong. Looting is wrong. You know, throwing things at the police is wrong. You know, and I don't support that. I don't want you to get the wrong idea here. You know, but so often with counter arguments, you accept some elements of the arguments. Yes, I can accept those things, but there's no evidence that it was Antifa. It was more peaceful than it was violent. When it was violent, it was often violent because of some of these things, and so on and so on and so on, right? So now we're getting into, if I'm finding evidence to back up these refutations, I want to focus on how I set up my evidence and how I follow up my evidence, okay? So source use should always be set up with signal phrases, and more often than not, paraphrased rather than quoted. Set up credibility and credentials as much as possible. And then source-based evidence needs to be followed up. What does the evidence suggest? How does this fit into my argument? I know sometimes I'm just reading you the text on the screen, but it also, I feel, emphasizes it. I'm trying not to do that all the time because that's a really bad technique. But I'm going to keep a lot of this content in the video, not in notes. So you're only going to get it here. So, so as not to read the screen, let me talk about this a little bit. So if you quoted material in your essay, then you need to deal with the language of the quote. There was a reason why you used the text word for word, other than you're just too lazy to rewrite it in your own words. You used it word for a reason. And the reason is that text has phrasing that needs to be unlocked and analyzed. So you need to do, you, the writer of your essay, need to do that analysis. So let's look at how I would set up some evidence for a completely different subject. So not for this one, because I just had this idea and it was easier for me to write. So this is for a completely different paper, but it shows what I'm talking about. So signal phrasing. As Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Matt Taibbi illustrates in Why So Many Damn Guns, published in Rolling Stone magazine, which has a great reputation for incisive investigative journalism, quote, only 5% of people with permits to carry concealed weapons nationwide from 2015 to 2020 were arrested for gun crimes. And then I have the site. Even though I've already said Matt Taibbi, written Matt Taibbi in my text, at least in my classes, I like you to repeat it in the site and have the locator. There are cases when you can use page numbers rather than paragraph numbers, especially if you have a PDF or you get the article in some sort of print form. That's okay. We'll talk about that elsewhere, not in here. But this is the full schmeal, right? This is the credentials of this guy. Won a Pulitzer. He's a journalist for Rolling Stone. It names the article he wrote. It's in Rolling Stone. Gives a little bit about Rolling Stone being credible. A lot of different ways I could have said that, but it does have a pretty good reputation. Then I have a quote. I quote this fact that Taibbi quotes in his article, and I cite it. Okay. So follow-up of this may include explaining. So what do I do with the follow-up? So I may explain the number of concealed weapon permits nationwide and what 5% of that number would be. Because it's not 5% of the nation. It's 5% of the people that have permits to carry concealed weapons nationwide. It may include explaining what a gun crime is, which may be more involved than just examples where somebody shot somebody. Explanations may also focus on why this is a significant statistic as compared to what? Those without gun licenses at all, those with gun licenses but not concealed carry permits, reflective of only a few states, as many do not have concealed weapon permit laws or not very open laws, restricting those who can have a concealed carry license. In fact, states have just opened up. Lots of states have just opened up their concealed carry laws to more people than previously, or to allow people with concealed carry laws to carry their weapons into places they previously were not allowed to carry their weapons, such as schools. Though schools have restricted people from bringing weapons onto their campuses, so even if the state says that you're no longer restricted from carrying a weapon onto school grounds, a school may say, yes, you are. We're saying you can't carry a weapon on our grounds, and we're allowed to say that because this is our school and we make the rules. And or the explanation analysis part may include moving on to other parts of Taibbi's article or other evidence that connects to it from other sources and expands the point. Always set up your source use and follow up the sharing of source-based evidence. Now, some high school instructors, as students have told me, drill students on a more seamless approach without as much or without any setup. Something more like this. All right, let me put that in. Of course, it keeps doing it. So grab my format, boom, all right. So same kind of thing. And yet an examination of the statistics proves that licensed gun owners are not the perpetrators of crimes because, quote starts, only 5% of people with permits to carry concealed weapons nationwide for 2015, 2020 were arrested for gun crimes. Same exact quote, same exact site. But notice there's no signal phrase. There's no hint of who Matt Taibbi is. In fact, Matt Taibbi's not mentioned in the sentence. We don't know where Matt Taibbi wrote this or the reputation of the place that published the thing that we're quoting. This is often taught in the high schools. Now, there's a merit to this approach. The sharing of the quote is somewhat seamless. It's baked right into the sentence. It's a tiny snip of a quote rather than like a big chunk of quote, because you don't want to quote so much. So big chunks of quotes are bad. It's set up by the essay's author, and though not signaled with credentials of the author and the source, it is set up in terms of what it's about, you know, before the quote is delivered. Which is better? Well, I would argue that the latter is all well and good for essay one, in or essay previous to our more advanced and sophisticated persuasive essay. But my former example is more appropriate for our persuasive essay. And as you move on to English 102, or even in speech, if you take that in lieu of 102, that's the kind of structures you're going to want to set up. You're going to want a signal phrase, your source with the writer. This is why I require you to use human authors that you can name, which is something that will not change in future quarters. This is why I want you writing about credentials and credibility in your source annotations, which again is something that I am not going to change in future assignments. So that's going to continue to be something that I'm going to want students to think about. Remember our mantra: quote rarely, summarize sometimes, paraphrase often. Quote rarely, summarize sometimes, paraphrase often. So do we really even need a direct quote in this case? I don't think so. There's nothing really special about this quote. There's no language that needs to be unlocked for its deeper meaning, just facts that need unpacking. We could just as easily have this. Okay, so I'm going to have to do all the shenanigans again here, so hang on. We could just as easily have, oh, no, it did it this time. Just as easily have this. Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Matt Taibbi illustrates in his article, Why So Many Damn Guns, published in Rolling Stone magazine, which has a great reputation for incisive investigative journalism, that a very fraction of the gun crimes committed each year between 2015 and 2020, 5%, were perpetrated by gun owners with permits to carry concealed weapons. Paraphrased. Because the quote's not necessary. I think, and I know I'm right about this, that most often students quote out of laziness. So much easier to just copy and paste a chunk of material from a source into your essay and wrap some content around it, rather than really work it in and rewrite it in your own words. That's harder, but it's better. It's much better. In fact, I actually look for this in assessment of student work. If I look through a persuasive essay and I see cites next to quotes, and I don't see any cites next to anything that isn't a quote. So in other words, the student is only citing quotations. Then I'll go back through the essay and look for facts, look for information that's been pulled from sources and paraphrased, but it isn't cited. And sometimes I find that, and that's plagiarism. And usually I don't really hammer a student for that kind of plagiarism, because it's usually just a misunderstanding. Students have often told me, I thought I only had to cite when I quoted word for word from the source. No, that's wrong. You have to cite any material that you pull out of sources that's not common knowledge. So you have to tell the reader where that came from. What I would like to see is more cites without quotations near them, so that you're paraphrasing. In fact, it would be lovely to have an essay in which there are no quotes, because sometimes it's not needed. So that's that. So, all right, moving on. This is probably, I haven't even been keeping track of how long this video is. It's way long, but it's very significant and important content. So paragraphs as sets. Paragraphs as sets. So sometimes the argument for a single claim is too big for one paragraph. And so a writer needs a set of paragraphs that derive from a master claim, and yet each paragraph has a claim of their own. So how do I link my paragraphs that work as a set? Because, to emphasize, each paragraph still has to have a claim of its own. A set of paragraphs that work together in an essay function much like the entire essay itself. The first paragraph leads with the master claim, a large claim to be explored in the paragraphs that follow, to avoid writing a gigantic paragraph. Gigantic paragraphs are not wrong in and of themselves, but they're difficult to digest. Each paragraph that follows the one with the master claim presents a claim that derives from it, with a strong transition to the claim before it, much like a thesis then generates a series of claims in paragraphs. So we're in our macrocosm, microcosm thing again, just like the chain of reasoning, because this is also a chain of reasoning, right? So something like this. Though the evidence shows that protests, so I'm back to my Black Lives Matter stuff. We just took a diversion to conceal weapons. Though the evidence shows that protests were by and large peaceful, the violence may have been necessary for healing. The smart police move in Minneapolis was abandoning a police station, et cetera, cathartic, therapeutic, as I had written before in my brainstorming, okay? So obviously my previous paragraph is about how the protests were by and large peaceful. I probably proved that. And now I'm gonna talk about how the violence is necessary for healing. And you'll notice it's a claim, it's debatable, it's got a why, it doesn't have a so what. It doesn't have a so what. The so what's kind of implied. The so what is, obviously all along I'm trying to change thinking. I'm trying to get at the truth. I'm trying to fight misinformation and clarify what actually happened, or change the narrative, which is a popular phrase, change how we talk about what actually happened. So one assumes that I've just proven this with evidence. The protests were mostly peaceful, and now I'm justifying the violence. From here on, I may argue another point, that the violence was escalated by some of the actions of the police or other peacekeepers, these unidentified Department of Justice operatives, inserting themselves in the situation, as well as outside agitators, anti-Black Lives Matter people who came to attack the Black Lives Matter protest and sparked a bunch of violence, or anti-Black Lives Matter people that were there provoking the Black Lives Matter protesters, who then reacted violently because they're being attacked verbally or in other ways. But I'm going to continue to develop my chain of reasoning. Notice that I link to my previous idea, and then I have my new idea, and then I'm going to explore that in a paragraph. And then if I have another paragraph, I'm going to do that same thing. Probably better to link both of my ideas, though evidence shows the protests were peaceful, and though when violent, they were often provoked to violence, so the violence had some sort of meaning. A new idea, right? Eventually, I'd move on to a new claim. Eventually, and I've never seen a student do more than 2 or 3 paragraphs of a set that work in interlocked claims from a master claim. I mean, we're still writing short essays in English 101. In English 102, this could get a little bigger, because we're doing a bigger writing project in English 102. But in English 101, you're not likely to, do, unless you go crazy. Some students have, and wrote basically a rough draft of an English 102 essay for English 101. I've had that. So let's go on to what the next claim will look like. And I'm nearing the end here. I am nearing the end because I don't have that much more I'm going to do. So, like those who argue that Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 were led by Antifa and other interlopers, okay, so I'm referencing the previous claim. And I'm still on the counterclaims, like those who argue, so I'm still on the counterclaim, counter-argument, the opponents. The protests themselves were less about championing the cause of Black lives, but instead they were terrorist attacks by angry rioters with no respect for life or private property, explosive, violent orgies of destruction and crime perpetrated by people fed up from sheltering in place, quarantine, and mask wearing in the pandemic. Just an angry mob seeking an excuse to burn property, loot, pillage, and attack police, trying to protect citizens not involved. It is time to change the narrative about these protests and reveal what they really are, which are opportunities for Antifa and other anarchists to promote their anti-government, anti-police, anti-American stance. Okay. Now, looking at this now and having, developed this content for all of you to try to teach you these concepts, I realize that maybe I don't want Antifa in the other counter argument. I just want to save it for here. Or maybe I just don't want to refute that till here. And I just want to double down on the Antifa thing here. But also this idea that they did turn violent because people were, this pent up anger and they had been, quarantined for so long, and some of that, right? Which I can agree with. I think that was definitely part of what happened. Like I said, you should be able to agree with some of what's in the counterclaims if you have some good, strong counterclaims that aren't just weak straw men. You don't know what I'm talking about, look up straw man, logical fallacy, or the assignment coming up, which will probably always be ahead, even if I reuse this video on logical fallacies. So you link the next claim with the previous claim and you create a new claim, in this case from the opposition's attitudes and opinions of the issue, and prepare to refute the next claim with evidence and reasoning in one or more paragraphs, just like we talked about before. The claims that follow, however, many will do the same. They will be extensions of the thesis. They will link the previous argument to the new argument. They will develop each argument in a single or a set of paragraphs led by claims with reasoning, source-based evidence, clear explanations. Once you've chained together all your links, you have an essay. If you save the thesis, save the writing of the thesis until you've assembled your arguments, now you can write a single sentence that incorporates all the claims in a problem solution structure, because you were developing that. And they would be your claims, not the counterclaims. You don't write a thesis about the counterclaims. You write it, although you could make the counterclaims part of the thesis. Maybe that's the problem. And maybe that's what I do in this essay. Now that I've structured it that way and added it up, perhaps in this essay, I'm arguing against the misconceptions and the outright falsehoods believed by my audience. So that's the problem. And the solution is the truth that I will prove with evidence and reasoning and arguments. Because people believe lists, misconceptions and untruths about Black Lives Matter protests. People believe these misconceptions and untruths when they hear them, especially if they're repeated over and over again. People tend to believe things that are said by people in authority or said by people they trust. When they're said over and over and over again, people just believe them without checking as to whether what the person is saying is actually true. If we were to always fact check what the person is actually saying, then maybe we wouldn't always believe the people we trust, or the people in authority. it would be my hope in this essay, as it was the students' hope that originally wrote it, that I was starting with, to convince Black Lives Matter detractors, people that disagree with Black Lives Matter, that once they truly understand what Black Lives Matter stands for and what the protests of summer 2020 were all about for most of the peaceful people that participated in them, then they can take action to either join the cause or no longer spread lies damaging Black Lives Matter. Maybe that would be my thesis. That was sort of the thesis the students started with that I'm basing this on, something like that. All right, wrapping this up. I hope you're inspired now to try something like this with your essay. The structure is not required, but I hope that you see it makes sense. And even if you don't lead with counter arguments, in fact, I'm going to come out because I don't know if I have any other things to show you. And it might be nicer to see me this way. Even if you don't lead with counter arguments, the lessons shared in this video are still valuable, and you still have to deal with counter arguments in your essay in some way. However, unlike previous essays, in this persuasive essay, you should deal with counter arguments along the way through each of your arguments, which is another reason why leading with them may be a better approach, as you will ultimately need to refute them. So let me get you so you grasp this concept. What I'm saying is that in a previous essay, you may have put all your counter arguments together in a single paragraph. In a good persuasive essay, you shouldn't do that. You should show the counter arguments to each of your claims. So you're either leading with your claim and eventually turning to the counter arguments, or, as I've been explaining here, you're leading with the counter arguments and refuting them, and ultimately making your claims as you refute the counter argument. It's still the same structure. In fact, the sets of paragraphs are often a point counterpoint sort of a structure. If you're starting with your claim, which is your point, and then you introduce a counterclaim maybe in the next paragraph, and maybe here you lead with a counterclaim, and then you refute it, or you figure out a different way to introduce them. But that's often the way it goes. All this instruction should emphasize that we study writing, and then we write, and then we analyze what we've written and labor to improve it. That's the process. We study writing, and we write, and then we analyze what we've written and we labor to improve it. And sometimes along with that analysis, we get feedback from peers, we get feedback from the instructor, we see a tutor, we talk to our mom, we talk to our sister that goes to Brown University out east or whatever. That's the process. Thinking about what you're going to do, how you're going to write before you write rather than after you've written is a wise way to do it. And yet often students struggle to plan ahead and conceive a plan for their work before they actually do it. Sometimes you got to shape the clay, look at what you've shaped, and then figure out how to better shape it. All right. Now I'm on to the last thing for the fourth question, which I'm going to do really quickly and wrap this. But I do have to go back to the page. And this is still about introducing the content for what I want to share, which is more things for the writing learning companion, things to remember. And I'm just going to do this very quickly because I'm just going to leave these on the page and I'm not going to go through all the stuff. And this will stay with this video regardless of reusing it in the future, because these are all lessons that are going to come up again and again. So I'm going to actually give you some stuff that you can just use for answering the question. But write in third person, limited use of first person, no second person, always a comma before, such as use of semicolon. Now, some of these classes will be different and I modify that. So I'll always teach the use of the semicolon or how to punctuate titles, but they'll be in different classes. I'll teach punctuation inside quotation marks, ethos, pathos, and logos. I always teach. Striving to have more than one piece of evidence for each paragraph, to multi-source use in paragraphs in sets, which I was teaching in this very video, the PI format that goes PI, IE, which iterates over information explanation, either in a single paragraph or multiple paragraphs. Is the same concept. Signal phrases and a resource for that, topic sentences, claim, controlling idea, claims, and a resource for that. So that's where I'm at. I'm losing my voice. I've talked a lot. Thank you so much for your kind attention. This is probably the biggest video I'm going to have this quarter. It's the biggest video I think I've ever made. I have no idea how long it is. It's way too long, but that's how I teach. That's what I do in the live classroom. I appreciate you. Thank you for paying attention. Do the thing. I'll be reusing this. I hope it's valuable instruction. Thanks so much. Hope your essays work out great. I can't wait to read them. Bye. I'll see you. Bye.